So, we're busy studying this mimer about Trias HaMesim, about the resurrection of the dead, and the comparison that the Rebbe is making between two different processes that happen to us, so to speak, after this life. The one process we know, it's called Gan Eden. And very often people are told, look forward to Gan Eden, one day you'll get to Gan Eden will be amazing, or however it is that people kind of express it. But the point is that Gan Eden is where souls go after they have lived this life. So what we've identified so far in our conversations is that Gan Eden is very much a graded spiritual experience. And that might sound like an interesting concept, a graded spiritual experience. But basically what it means is that you go through different stages, you go through different steps before you're able to get to Gan Eden, or to the next level of Gan Eden. In other words, souls are consistently moving throughout the experience of Gan Eden, and you keep growing and you keep developing, and to grow and to develop means to be exposed to more godliness and more godliness. But the entire process, as we've already defined, is graded. So what that really tells us is two things. Firstly, it tells us that the way we earn a place in Gan Eden is dependent on a particular kind of investment that we've made in our lives. And we've identified that is through learning Torah. So as a person goes through life and as a person learns Torah, so they earn the opportunity to be in Gan Eden. The second thing that we've learned about Gan Eden is, although it's a place and an experience of divine revelation, what Hashem reveals to us has its limits. And the most obvious limit is you have to earn it. So we identified early on in this mimer that there's a strange and almost paradoxical reality. The reality that's paradoxical is the greater Hashem's presence is, the less it depends on us to be able to achieve it. So in Gan Eden, where you have to deserve, firstly, entry to Gan Eden, you have to deserve. Secondly, to be able to progress from one level of Gan Eden to the next level of Gan Eden also has to do with what you deserve. That actually tells us that the godliness which is available in Gan Eden has its limitations. It's only made for certain people or for certain levels of soul. We then contrasted that with the experience of Trias HaMesim, that Mashiach will come. At the time of the coming of Mashiach, there will be a greater revelation, and that is a revelation that we will have earned by doing mitzvahs. And mitzvahs are far more accessible than Torah, because not everybody learns Torah, and everybody learns Torah at different levels. So that means that everybody's experience and spiritual access is different. Whereas mitzvahs, everybody's got mitzvahs. Even the people who deliberately try not to have mitzvahs, they also have mitzvahs. So much so that the Talmud uses the expression to say that even the greatest Jewish sinner is filled with mitzvahs like a pomegranate is filled with seeds. So we all have mitzvahs. And also, when you do a mitzvah, it actually doesn't make a difference who you are. You know, when you learn Torah, the more intelligent person obviously gets more than the person who's simpler. When you do a mitzvah, everybody gets exactly the same experience of mitzvah. That tells me that there is more or a greater or a higher experience of godliness that is available to us when we do a mitzvah, because it doesn't have the same restrictions, it doesn't have the same limits. Anything that is unlimited is clearly more powerful. So when Mashiach comes, we get to experience a deeper, more powerful revelation of godliness, one that is available pretty much to everybody and without the same kind of limitations as a soul would have to have in Gan Eden. Later in the Messianic age, we enter a different phase altogether, which is called Trias HaMesim, the time of the resurrection of the dead. And we said that the resurrection of the dead is a perplexing concept. Like, surely the ultimate experience is to get out of the body, no longer have these limitations, no longer have to sleep 8 hours and eat 3 times a day with snacks in between, no longer lose concentration in the middle because you got a WhatsApp, no longer all the various limitations that we have of the human body. Surely the ultimate spiritual, divine, godly, holy experience is to run from the physical. Why does Judaism look forward to a resurrection experience? So for exactly the reason that we've just seen. Because when Hashem reveals his true colors, when Hashem reveals his true revelation, then it's not restricted or bound by any rules, including the rule of having to deserve it. So at the time of the resurrection of the dead, Hashem is making a very powerful statement, which is, I don't have to only engage with you at the spiritual level in order to connect with you. I can even connect with you on the physical plane. And not only can I connect with you on the physical plane, I can even connect with you in the deepest fashion in the physical plane. So then we said the Mishnah tells us, Kol Yisrael yesh lahem chelek le'olam haba, that every single one of us has a portion in that experience, in that so-called world to come, the time of the resurrection. And you say, what? To get into Gan Eden, this great spiritual experience, the elevation of the soul and connection to Hashem, for that I have to earn it. Not everybody gets there. And even if you do get there, not everybody gets to the same level of the experience. And yet this incredible thing, Olam Haba, which is the ultimate revelation of Godness, Kol Yisrael, everybody, equal access, no restrictions. How does that happen? So we said, because there are three possible levels of connection to Hashem. There's the level of connection that we construct through study. That has its limits, the limits of our own abilities. There is the level of connection that we achieve through mitzvahs. Mitzvahs, less restriction. Of course, you actually have to do the mitzvah in order to benefit, but mitzvahs, everybody can do a mitzvah, and everybody can access mitzvahs at their level, and yet the mitzvah is as valuable as if you were the greatest sage on earth. Comes the time of Treatise HaMeisim, the time of the resurrection of the dead. Hashem reveals to us that, guess what? He doesn't love and connect with us because of what we've learned, nor does he love and connect with us because of what we have done. He loves and connects with us because of who we are. And the metaphor that we used in this discussion was the difference between the child when you come home from school and the teachers told you that your child has done well at the classwork, so you get nachas, you get absolutely nachas, versus when you come home from the parent-teachers evening and the teacher tells you your child is a wonderful human being. So I'm not assessing your child just on academics, but they're a wonderful person. You get even more nachas. And sometimes you get the most nachas actually just watching your child, even sleeping, where you realize that you love this person for who they are, not for what they have done or what they have learned. Gan Eden, Hashem shows us how much he loves us for what we have dedicated in learning. That experience allows us an opportunity that the soul can continuously grow and develop. And as we learned in the last portion, in order to grow and develop, it always has to shed the skin of the last spiritual experience in order to access the next spiritual experience. Then you have the time of Mashiach in the early part of the Olam Haba. That's why Hashem says, I don't just love you because of what you've learned. I love you because of what you do. Look at the amazing things that you do. You're amazing. You say you're not religious. You say you're a sinner. But look at the amazing things that you do. I love you for that. And then we get to the ultimate state of Olam Haba, Treatise HaMeisim, resurrection of the dead, at which point Hashem says, I don't love you for what you've done. I love you for who you are. So with that in mind, let's have a look at the next part of this mimer. So we understand the direction that we're going, and now we're going to do a further analysis of the distinction between the Gan Eden experience and the Olam Haba experience. Gan Eden, heaven, we already defined previously in this mimer, is related to the concept of Mamale Kol Olmin, a particular way that Hashem radiates energy into the world that is Mamale. It is personally suited to each aspect and element of the world. Versus what will be revealed at the time of Mashiach, and specifically at the time of the resurrection, which is Soivev Kol Olmin, something that is beyond being tethered or defined by the specific realities of either our consciousness or our environment or what the world can or cannot tolerate. So that places us, if you have a look, that places us in paragraph Vav, paragraph 6. So it's not an especially long mimer. For those people who usually come to the mimer class, you're used to these things taking months and months to conclude. But actually, this is a relatively short mimer, and we're in the second last paragraph, which means between this week and next week, please God, we'll wrap it up, and then we'll move to a different mimer, possibly related to the Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur period. We'll see. No promises. Okay. So let's explain all of this in greater detail. All of this meaning, why it is that a neshama, when it is in Gan Eden, in order to progress from level A of Gan Eden to level B of Gan Eden, as we learned in the previous paragraph, has to firstly shed its old self, its old persona. Secondly, it has to be completely overwhelmed and overawed by the new reality and the new revelation. So those are two methods, so to speak, of deconstructing the original soul so that it can be reconstructed to experience something absolutely beyond itself. So we need to understand why that is, and then of course to contrast it against the experience of the world to come. So we can explain it. Okay, so in order to understand what's going on over here, we need to identify a very important term that is often used in Chassidus. What is the term? Hishtalshelus. It's an onomatopoeic word. You can almost hear in the word the nature of what it represents. So we're talking about a particular means of connection between Hashem and us that is called the Or HaMemale. And Or HaMemale requires Hishtalshelus in order to impact. So these are terms that may not be familiar to us, and you might be at this point scratching your head and saying, what are these things? Memale, Hishtalshelus, what is it? It's usually helpful for us to step out of terminology and jargon and out of spirituality and talk about things that we could relate to as humans, things that happen to us in our daily experience. And those will help us. They'll give us parables and metaphors that we can use in order to unpack this information. So let's talk about ourselves for a little bit. When we have to interact with other people, there are various ways in which we could interact. One of those ways, which is going to be relevant for our conversation, is when we have to explain. Right? You've got to explain something. So let's say you're a teacher. You have to explain something to the students. Let's say that you're a parent. You have to explain something to your child. Let's say that you are in a position where you've got to lead a team. So in order to be able to lead the team, you have to explain to them what the vision of the team is and where you plan to go and what you plan to do and so on and so forth. So you've got all these things that you've got to explain to people. Now, when you've got to explain to people, there are two things that are incredibly important to be conscious of. Number one, that you already know stuff in your head that they have no idea about. In other words, you have to be careful not to take for granted what you know in your head and to imagine that they know that too. Unfortunately, sometimes this happens with teachers, sometimes it happens with parents, sometimes it happens with friends, with partners, with team leaders, that we make assumptions about what the other person knows. And we assume that just because we see things in a particular way, they see it in that way too. When you do that, inevitably what happens is you land up not giving them all of the information that they require, and then things fall apart. And then somebody gets frustrated, or possibly everybody gets frustrated. Why didn't you listen to me? Why didn't you tell me? So when it comes to explain, it's always important for a person to understand that there is a process you will have to follow called hishtalshelus, and we'll talk about what that is. The second thing that is really important about explaining, not only should you not take for granted that what's in your head is also in their head, the other thing that's really important about explanation is you have to know that their head doesn't operate the same as your head. So not only do they not know things that you already know, and you can't make assumptions, like people often turn around and say, isn't it obvious? No, it's not obvious. Just because something is obvious to you does not mean that it's obvious to the next person. And that's not only because they lack information, it's also because they think differently. So that is what we call memale. Memale means I need to find a way that this information can fill their head. It already fills my head. That's great. I got this. I understand this. I know this. But there's no value in it filling my head if they're the team. There's no value in me having clarity if you're the student. Right? The whole chap of a teacher is to work out what the other person needs to know. So that's memale kol almin. So there are two very important critical processes that have to happen in order to explain something to somebody else. If you don't follow these two principles, they'll be absolutely stymied, or they will think worse. They'll think they understand, and then they'll act on what they think they understand, and you'll think they understand, and it'll end up being this terrible miscommunication and frustration, but you didn't do what I said. So memale kol almin means that when one person interacts with the next person, you could choose one of two ways. You could choose to interact with them where you explain yourself, or you could choose to interact with them where you pull rank. If you pull rank, that's what we would call soivev kol almin. You come in, as the expression goes in English, you come over their head. I am the authority. You have to listen to me. It actually makes no difference to me whether you appreciate it or you don't, whether you understand it or not. I'm the boss, so you have to listen. Now, you could do that as a parent. You could do that as a team leader. You could do that as a government leader. People do it. And it may or may not succeed. But the bottom line is you didn't care in the first place whether or not the people would appreciate it. You only cared about your power and authority. That's what we would call soivev kol almin. I come to overwhelm you so that you'll listen to me. Memale kol almin means we want to create rapport. We want to have a relationship. I'd like to actually talk to you. I'd like feedback from you. I'd like a meeting of minds. I'd like to feel a sense of connection. In order to experience that, in order to have that meeting of minds, in order to feel that connection, so we've got to create rapport between us. We've got to create a connection between us. And that actually may very well mean that before I start the explanation, I might have to do other things that have nothing at all to do with the explanation, just to create rapport. So I might need to ask you, for example, how you're doing, how you managing during the COVID crisis, how's your family. Whether or not that's actually valuable information to me, I need to create that point of connection. Once I create that point of connection, I then also have to start to understand and appreciate, how do you think? Are you the kind of person who processes things visually? In which case, I need to use visual cues to make this understandable to you. Are you the kind of person who processes things auditory? In which case, I'm going to have to use auditory cues in order to get the message to you, and so on. Are you a very rational person? Are you a very creative person? So depending on those factors, if I want a memale personalized experience, the better I know that, the more successful the experience will be. Incidentally, that's one of the major drawbacks of having these online classes, is that the feedback from the crowd is extremely limited. For one, most people turn off the cameras. So you can't even read the facial expressions. Are you with me? Are you following what I'm saying? Or are you completely lost in the side of your head? Difficult, right? So it's difficult to have a memale experience where you can't have that two-way interaction, where you can't receive that feedback. Second of all, it's quite limiting to ask a question. When people are sitting around in a dynamic human face-to-face environment, so you don't understand something, you can kind of raise your hand. Over here, you've got to find the technology, and at which point can I interrupt? And the teacher doesn't see that I have a question, so they're not ready to pause, and they're just like rolling out information. So this is more of a soivev kind of an interaction. The person driving the show talks. Teaches. You get it, you don't get it. Maybe occasionally somebody will pop something onto the chat and say, I don't understand. But a real memale experience will be very personal. And it will be very much about the recipient, about the people in my team, about my child, about the student. That's where the orientation will be. That's why I need Ishtalshelus. So what does Ishtalshelus mean? Like I said, you can hear in the word, you can hear Ishtalshelus. You can hear this concept. It represents an evolutionary process. The word Ishtalshelus is related to the word Shalshelis, which is a chain. So if you can picture in your mind what a chain looks like, the chain, it's interesting. not only is there a chain reaction, we talk about the concept of a chain reaction. So there's an evolutionary process. There's a domino effect, which is, of course, what ishtalshelus means. But there's a nuance to the concept of ishtalshelus, which is quite important over here. And that is when you think of a chain, the links overlap. Now that's an important part of ishtalshelus. The links overlap. So if you could picture that there's a chain hanging vertically, the top ring, we'll call it ring number 1, links with the next ring, which we'll call link number 2, in such a way that part of link number 1 is actually under number 2, and part of link number 2 is actually over number 1. That makes sense? The bottom of the higher link is lower than the top of the lower link. In other words, ishtalshelus doesn't just mean a domino effect, where there's some kind of a chain reaction that I've got to create, starting from my brain and eventually getting to my team. There's actually got to be a sense of overlap. That's this feedback. The team also has to be part of my reality, as I have to get my information to be part of their reality. So the classic ishtalshelus that we always talk about is the ishtalshelus within a human being themselves, the transition and evolution from ideas to feelings, to commitments, to practice, to sharing, as an example. But we were talking over here about an example of teaching, so let's talk about teaching. How does ishtalshelus work within teaching? The concept as it sits in my mind. It's interesting, if you've ever had to teach somebody or you've ever had to share, we've all done it, right? You have to share something with your child, you have to share something with your team. So there's always that moment where you start talking, and as you start talking, you begin to realize that this might not be as easy as you imagined it was going to be. When you had the vision in your own mind, it was absolutely clear. Now that you have to put it into words, you sometimes feel the words are failing me. It's just not coming out. It doesn't sound like it feels in my head. So there is an ishtalshelus over there, because the way an idea sits in our own mind is quite intangible. It's quite spiritual at that point in time. It's completely just in the realm of thought. And the realm of thought is an intangible place. So you don't, for example, have to think in full sentences. You don't necessarily have to think in an orderly fashion. It's okay if in your mind, if that's how your mind works, and ideas flash around, and 1 second you're thinking about this and then you're thinking about that, and it's all on the same topic and it all kind of networks together, but it doesn't have a chronological process. That's okay. It works for you because in your own mind you have a certain clarity. When you start to tell it to somebody else, that would be an absolute disaster. If the words just come tumbling out and the concepts just kind of flow in a haphazard way, the person's not going to know what on earth you're talking about. So when somebody's very excited, for example, ever had a conversation with somebody who's like overly excited, and they start saying this, and then they move to that, and then and you actually don't know what they're talking about. And you might be tempted to tell them, whoa, take it easy, breathe, tell me, what are you actually thinking? And they might be frustrated at you that, they're so excited and you're trying to kill their excitement. So on a less dramatic scale, that's actually what happens in our own minds. There's the thought as it is in my head, which is possibly intangible and possibly haphazard and not in an orderly fashion. That's not going to help in order to transfer it to the next person. So the first ishtalshelus, the first evolution that has to happen in my head is I have to move away from that nebulous, chaotic version of how I see things, which is clear to me, but would be confusing to anybody else. And I have to be mishtalshel. I have to evolve to a next step, which is to organize my thoughts. Some people find that very easy to do. Some people battle with that, to organize their own thoughts inside their own head. So what I might actually have to do is not do the exercise in my head. I might need to take a paper and pen and organize my thoughts on paper. So I might create a mind map and then work out how to categorize and how to organize things. Maybe that's not my style. Maybe I like bullet points. And then I'll have to cross things out and reorder them and say, actually, this comes first and that comes next. But that's part of the ishtalshelus, the translation of an idea as I've got it in this abstract form in my head into an idea that is organized in my own mind. And by the way, I can't necessarily stand in front of my child with my paper and start saying, okay, so this is, I can't do that. I'm talking to my child. So I've got to prepare this back in my head, even if the tools that I use happen to be paper or whatever it is. I need to then put that back into my head and have it clear in my head. That's point one, which has these 3 sub-points. Then I go from there to point 2. This is how I remember the transition from point 1 to 2. So you might use a mnemonic or whatever other memory aid you might want to use, so that in your own head it's now clear to be able to share it with the next person. Then there's the next phase of the Hishtalshelus. The next phase of the Hishtalshelus is to take it out of what is now organized thought, but still thought, and to start to decide what terms and expressions I'm going to use to share that thought. Because even in my mind, when I have organized thoughts, it could be in very adult language, and I need to talk to my child, and adult language is not going to necessarily work. So I've got to now go through the next Hishtalshelus, which is, what kind of terminology am I going to use? What kind of references and imagery am I going to use that's going to be suited to this particular recipient? And then I might realize, next stage of the Hishtalshelus, then I might realize that actually the idea is too abstract for a child, or my team doesn't see my vision, so I've got to kind of illustrate it to them in some way. Or the people who I'm teaching have never learned this kind of subject matter before, so while the terms that I've now organized in an orderly fashion make sense in my mind, many of those terms could be completely foreign to the group. So then you need the next level of Hishtalshelus, which is called the downgrading of the information into terminology that is relatable and imagery that is relatable. And I might have to come up with parables, and I might have to come up with all kinds of ways in order to be able to convey. And then the final stage of the Hishtalshelus would be the actual presentation. Now that part of the Hishtalshelus, the product that I'm presenting, might look completely different to how it looked in my initial thought process. Firstly, now it's organized. Secondly, now it's in words as opposed to thoughts. Thirdly, it's now associated with metaphors and parables and imagery that I don't necessarily need for myself. And in fact, I might actually find them to be a little bit immature. But that's a critical part of this Hishtalshelus, this developmental process, in order to be able to actually share successfully. So, we have spoken in this Maimer about how in Gan Eden, the neshama is exposed to a degree of godliness which is called Memale Kol Olmin. That means to say, Hashem making his energy available to the soul at a level that the soul can appreciate it. Not that the soul has to be completely ripped apart and upgraded majorly in order to be able to experience it. The soul as it is can experience and appreciate this degree of divine revelation. Then the soul will graduate. Having learnt and mastered that particular experience, it will now be ready to graduate to a new experience, where, as we've discussed, it will have to lose a little bit of its outlook and persona, and it will have to be overawed by the new experience, and then it will enter that new experience, and now there'll be an Hishtalshelus, there'll be a further development. So now you remember when you were 6 years old and we spoke about that particular subject? Well, now you're 16 years old. We can go revisit that same subject. I can actually explain it to you in terms that I could never have used then, because you've grown up and because you have more experience and you have more insight. So you're actually, the student, the child, the team member, or whoever, you're actually able to start to climb up because it's a chain. You can actually start to climb up that chain. Because there are steps, intermediate steps, you can actually find your way to me. So that's what happens in Gan Eden. Hashem gives us this graded experience of divine revelation that has gone through an Hishtalshelus to be suited to the neshama. So there are so many steps along the way, from the way Hashem, so to speak, sees himself or understands himself, which we will never be able to relate to. But he's put in so many steps all the way down to us that the neshama can start climbing steps. It will never get anywhere close. It's an infinite ladder. It's an infinite chain, but it can begin to climb steps and have experiences. That is called Memale Kol Olmin. That is the experience of divine revelation that happens in the higher realm of Gan Eden. And most of this paragraph will be dedicated to explaining and exploring this process of Memale Kol Olmin. So, how does it work in Hashem's terms? Hashem's got this great divine revelation that he would like to share with a neshama. Neshama of Abi Cohen passed away at X particular time. He's now in Shamayim, And Hashem would like to reveal godliness to him, because Abi Cohen was a decent guy and he learned some Torah, he went to a shir every single day or once a week or whatever it was. And so now he deserves to have some of the beauty and experience of Gan Eden. And there he is. And Hashem would like to share something with him. The only thing is that Abi Cohen is not Moshe Rabbeinu, and his understanding and his level of learning Torah has its limitations, and therefore the degree to which he can enjoy this divine revelation also has its limitations. So Hashem's got to put that divine revelation through an incredible series of hishtalshelus steps. A whole lot of downgrades, a whole lot of filters, a whole lot of processing, a whole lot of evolution. So let's see what he does. We're on the second line of paragraph Vav, halfway across the line. The first stage of the process, and you'll notice that the word that keeps repeating over here is the word to be mislabesh, which comes from the word levush. A levush is a garment. And so mislabesh means to become invested. It means to clothe itself in. And that's exactly what we're doing when we're trying to explain something to somebody else. We clothe it not in my clothes, in other words, the way I see and understand things, because that's beyond what the student can understand, what the child can understand. So I try and clothe the information in their clothes. In other words, in terminology and imagery that they could relate to. So the first step in preparing this divine revelation for the souls that will be in Gan Eden is mislabesh benivroim haruchniim. The first is that Hashem recalibrates his divine revelation to be suited to the greatest spiritual beings that exist. So if you have a look throughout the Torah, we make reference to all kinds of spiritual beings. People like to use the generic term angels. There's an advantage and disadvantage to that. Probably the disadvantage is that you have a picture in your mind of what an angel is, and it's got wings and it's white and shiny. I don't know exactly what picture people have of angels. And when we talk about spiritual beings, there are spiritual beings that are way beyond anything that we could ever begin to imagine. The Torah talks about things called oifanim, which implies some kind of a circular energy. That's one kind of a spiritual being. It talks about chayos hakodesh, which is translated as the holy animals, or it could mean the holy energy. Chayos. Seraphim, we talk about angels that are combustible. In other words, they have such a compelling love of Hashem that it literally burns them at every moment. We don't understand what any of those things are. They're all metaphoric. So the first stage of the transition, of the evolutionary process of preparing this divine revelation for a neshama when it will get to Gan Eden, is to first embed that divine revelation within the reality and the realm of the highest spiritual beings, who are way beyond anything that even a neshama could imagine in the early stages of Gan Eden. And then what Hashem does is he then further downgrades or evolves that divine revelation to now be suited to the next level down of spiritual beings. So we started up at the highest level of spiritual beings, and then from there it gets translated into the language of lower spiritual beings, into imagery that they could relate to. So he's going to say something now that's really fascinating. Shehei merak k'moy moshel lenivroim ha'elyonim. What distinguishes a so-called higher and lower spiritual being? It's difficult for us because we're so grounded in the physical reality that as far as we're concerned, if something is higher or lower, so straight away you start to think about levels, about physical levels. You start to think about skyscrapers. You start to think about up and down. You start to think about heaven and earth. You start to think perhaps about further out in the universe or further out in the universe, whatever our particular imagery is. And everybody, I suppose, has a different view of what it all looks like. So we tend to understand the words higher and lower as above and below. The truth is, higher and lower, and the Rambam talks about this in his introduction, in the early chapters of Mishnah Torah, the 14-volume work of Jewish law. So he talks about the fact that when we talk higher and lower in that realm, what we mean is more advanced or less advanced. More spiritually open or less spiritually open. What he says over here is fascinating. So let's just, for the sake of argument, just put them into two classes. Ultimate spiritual beings and lesser spiritual beings. Because that's what we're going to talk. We're not going to label them. We're not going to say angels. We're not going to say seraphim or any of those things. Because that's beyond the scope of what we're doing over here. Let's just simply say ultimate spiritual beings and lesser spiritual beings. So what distinguishes an ultimate spiritual being from a limited spiritual being? He tells us the limited or the lesser spiritual being is the equivalent of a parable compared to the original information. So think about this for a second. What is a parable? So you got a piece of information that you need to share with somebody, but you know they're not going to understand it. You have to explain something to your child, and you know that they're not going to understand it. So you dig around in your own imagination, or you consult, and you come up with a story. You're going to tell the child a story. And the nature of the story is it's actually not going to talk the language of the real cerebral information that is associated with this particular thing, but it's going to help the child to be able to relate to it. So you know that at the end of this process, the child will not walk out with a full academic understanding of the topic, but that's not your goal. What they will achieve, and this is your goal, is they'll understand the general idea. So that they'll understand that this is important. They'll understand that this is dangerous. They'll understand that this is how families work. They'll understand that this is how countries work. Whatever it is that we want to illustrate to them. So a parable is an immature version of the original. Let's say, for argument's sake, that a child wants to know, how do viruses spread? Okay, so you could sit down with a professor of epidemiology and you could explain that the virus is a kind of a parasitic organism that lives in a host environment. The host is the human being, how the human being breeds that virus, how it grows, what kind of conditions are susceptible, how does the immune system fight against the virus, how does it spread, and droplets, and how long it can remain on a surface, and the concept of an invisible enemy. You can do a whole thing like that. Or, as somebody quite brilliantly did at a school somewhere overseas, you come into the class and you give everybody a little packet of glitter. And then you tell them you've got to look after this packet of glitter. So it's not a packet that's properly sealed. And then you see how the glitter goes all over the place. And you say, that's how a virus works. Now, is a virus glitter? No. Can you see a virus? No. Okay, so it's not perfect. You're right. But we're talking to the age group that we need to get this message across to. Glitter works for them. So the child walks out of there thinking that there's some kind of toxic glitter that's getting spread all over the place, and that's why you've got to be careful and try and clean your hands and do whatever you've got to do, social distance, whatever you've got to do in order to keep safe. Could you imagine if the same professor of epidemiology got up in front of his students at university and started to play with glitter? Listen, it could be very effective actually, but it's a bit immature. So when we talk about lesser spiritual beings, that's effectively what we're saying. It's the same divine concept. It's just that now it's being presented in more childish terminology, in lesser terminology. It's the same revelation of godliness. It's just been calibrated for somebody who can't really appreciate what these things are. That's called Hishtalshelus. It's this developmental evolution from intense, unmitigated godliness to the experience of a soul in Gan Eden. And thereafter, that same spiritual revelation, that divine revelation, starts to evolve lower and become even less original and even less clear and even more coated in story and imagery and that kind of thing. This is something that is spoken about extensively in Hasidus, that the Tanakh tells us King Solomon was such an incredibly wise man that he was able to present 3,000 metaphors for any given topic. Shkoyach. So you're very creative. Come up with 3,000 different mishalim, 3,000 different metaphors or parables. What's the brilliance in that? So the brilliance is not just that he had a creative mind and he could come up with a lot of stories. The brilliance is that Shlomo HaMelech, King Solomon, was able to take one concept and explain it at 3,000 different levels. For that level, the person would need that metaphor and then they would get it. And for this level, the person would need a simpler metaphor and then they would get it. And then that person would need the simplest of metaphors and then they would get it. And in each case, they would get it. They wouldn't understand the full academic depth of the topic, but they would get it. They would understand what it's talking about. That's what's happening over here. You're not going to get it. When a neshama is in Gan Eden, it's not going to get it. It's not going to see the full academic appreciation or the full visual appreciation of Hashem's godliness and revelation. But you'll get it. You'll realize, oh, there's godliness here. And it's special. And it's beautiful. And it's impressive. And it's the best thing I've ever been exposed to. That you will get. ויש לומר שזהו הטעם שהעלייה בגן עדן. שבגן עדן הגילו דאר הממלא כנ"ל, ממדרגה למדרגה היא על ידי שמסברת ממדרגה התחתונה. Now with that information we can appreciate what we said in the previous paragraph. That in order for a soul to graduate from one experience and level of Gan Eden to the next experience and level of Gan Eden, what it will need to do is shed the old self. Why is that signal? Why is that necessary? Why do you have to shed the old self? כי כמוי שהמשך הממלא למטה היא על ידי שמסלבש באוהד לבוש ובאוהד לבוש. על דרך זה הוא בעלייה ממטה למעלה שהעלייה היא על ידי הפשטת הלבוש ביטול מדרגה הקודמת. It's absolutely logical. The way that divine revelation is shared from the highest, most sublime level to a lower level is by putting on another layer of filter, what we call a levush, another garment, and then another garment, and then another garment, another layer, another metaphor, another simplifying of the concept, until eventually it's presentable to the newbie neshama in Gan Eden. So logically, if that's how the revelation came downwards, if the neshama now wants to move upwards, the way to do it is strip away a layer, strip away another layer. So let's understand that again. If we have to explain something to somebody, let's say a parent who has to explain a concept to a child. So we know that the gap in life experience, actual knowledge, and developed mature intelligence between the parent and the child is quite a few steps in difference. Now, the child might be very smart. The child might be brilliant. The fact of the matter is the child still hasn't learned the things that the parent has learned, doesn't have the experience that the parent has had, and doesn't have the maturity that the parent has. So therefore, what the parent has to do is, in order to prepare this information for the child, exactly what we've just spoken about. Moshel upon moshel upon moshel. One layer of simplification, another layer of simplification, another layer of simplification, until eventually it's ready for that child. Now what happens as the child grows up? If you're a good parent, as we all are, right? So what happens as the child grows up? You revisit. You go back to the same topic because it's relevant, because it comes up. And you say to the child, now I can remove a layer. So remember I used to tell you whatever. Now I can tell you a little bit more about how it actually works. And it's not as simple as the first time that I presented the concept to you. I can now remove some of the tactile, childish nursery rhyme version of it, and I can start to tell you a little bit more abstractly. And then the child matures further, and now is an adolescent, and is now capable of relating to abstract concepts, and not everything has to be explained in tangible terms. Okay, now I can strip away another layer. Now I can actually tell you more information in its pristine form than I could have told you originally. And then eventually that child goes on, let's say for argument's sake, to study this particular topic at university, because this is the career that they want to follow. This is the degree that they want to have. Now I can actually talk to you as an adult about the topic. So let's say you've got a parent who's a doctor, and then the child who eventually also decides to study medicine. At that point in time, we can get rid of all of the mishalim, all of the parables that I used to have to tell you when you were a little kid. When you were a little kid, I used to tell you, like there's these little engines inside the human body, and they transport things, and they alert if part of the body is injured. There's like an alarm system that goes off, and then there's teams that are sent to repair the wound or whatever. Now you could talk tachlis. You could talk real. So that's exactly how it is. It's a logical process. If from the source of the information I have to filter, simplify to reach the immature mind, then as that mind matures, we can afford now to remove the simplification. We can afford now to strip away some of the obscurity of the information. Now, in the case of a neshama in Gan Eden, it's not unlike the growth of the child. Because before I, the parent, can peel away a layer of explanation and start to expose the real information to the child, before that can happen, the child will have had to peel away some of the immaturity of being a 5-year-old. So if my 10-year-old still thinks and behaves like a 5-year-old, I'm not ready to peel away any layers yet, because they haven't let go of who they were. That's called growing up. Growing up is, I used to be somebody who absolutely loved whatever, absolutely loved being in the sandpit and making tunnels for imaginary highways. Absolutely, that was my thing. Okay, now the kid is 10 years old. It's not so much about building tunnels in the sandpit, but this child is forever balancing things. So it's, will this be able to stand? What if I do it at this angle? How much load can it handle? So you're no longer the child in the sandpit. You're now able to understand a little bit more about engineering, about structures, about forces of physics. Okay, so we can start to talk. Child goes to high school. Now we can start to talk not just about, oh, look at that. Isn't that interesting? If you put that at that angle, it collapses. But you put it at this angle, it's supported. Right? When you put your blocks, don't put them all next to each other, overlap them so that it's got more structural integrity. Now the child is in high school, so they no longer look through the eyes of a child who says, wow, this is all just so cute. It's starting to actually think, what is the logic behind this? How does this thing actually work? How do physics work in real terms? Okay, so now you have shed who you were, so we can now shed some of the child speak that we used to use when we spoke about this particular topic. Now it's no longer, oh, that's so cute, I hope it doesn't collapse. Now it's, this is how you're going to ensure that it doesn't collapse. This is the angle that you need. This is the span that you can have between blocks, and so on and so forth. So it's exactly the same with the neshama. Hashem has created a graded level of spiritual revelation, of divine revelation. It's called Gan Eden. All of those layers are available, much like all the information is available in your mind. It's just a question of when the child is ready to be able to hear it. So the neshama has to disengage from who it used to be, who could only accept information in an extremely limited fashion. And the child has to now prepare to hear and learn things that it never could have heard or learned before. And that might be a little bit overwhelming. Yes, but that's called growing up. You know what they say, that the kids who do very well in high school are the kids who are often very stressed when they start out at university. Because in high school, let's say you've got a classroom of 25 kids. And here is the top A student of that class. So in that reality, I'm king. But when you take that same child and you put them into first year medicine, who's in the first year medicine class? All the kids who were the top in their class. And now suddenly you're no longer top of the pyramid, and there might be a whole lot of people who are ahead of you. That's called growing up. Suddenly it's daunting. Who I used to be is no longer relevant in this environment. That's what happens to a neshama. So the neshama reaches a point in Gan Eden, unbelievable. This is fantastic. I'm experiencing, there's revelation, I'm uplifted. It's the most wonderful thing that's ever happened to me. And we say, okay, now you're no longer going to be in that comfortable position. Why? It's not a bad thing, because we're going to upgrade you. We're going to challenge you. We're going to move you to a place where there's a great amount more that is available. Yet, in order to have it, you've actually got to let go of the old self and be willing to embrace a new possible reality. Okay, so the next piece, which is the piece in brackets, might just be just a little bit too much for us to try and squeeze into the time that we have left. I'm not one of these people who enjoys pushing just because we've got words on a page, so let's quickly squeeze them in before the time is up. So I'd prefer personally that we leave that segment for next week, and if we do well next week, we could complete the mimer, and then please God move on to something else. So I'm going to pause at this time and just open up if anybody has any questions or comments on what we have learned so far. Oh, I just realized nobody can unmute themselves. 1 second, let's change that.